The sun had already begun to dip behind the dense canopy, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain. The wilderness stretched out before him, silent and still, save for the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of a bird. The remote sanctuary, a vast stretch of untamed land nestled between two high ridges, was a place where the world outside seemed to cease. It was in this place that the animals ruled, and the humans were mere visitors, rare and careful intruders in a world that had long forgotten their kind. He had come here to study the ostriches. These majestic creatures, the largest birds on Earth, were a rare sight in the wild. Though their numbers had dwindled over the years, there was still a small, healthy population within the sanctuary, left to roam and breed without the threat of human interference. As a wildlife researcher, he was drawn to their habits, their behavior, and the mysteries they held within the folds of their towering bodies and piercing eyes. But in this place, things were never quite as simple as they seemed. The first sign of trouble came as the light waned. The sounds of the forest, distant cicadas, the rustling of small animals, the chirping of birds, faded into a heavy silence. He had noticed it before, but never quite to this extent. The silence was thick, palpable, as though the animals themselves had grown still, waiting for something. Moving cautiously through the underbrush, he pushed forward, trying to make sense of the strange quiet. His eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Not even the usual chatter of the forest's smaller creatures. He spotted them in the distance, the ostriches. There were 3 of them, their long necks stretching high above the grasses as they wandered in the open clearing. They moved in an eerie, synchronized manner, their sharp eyes scanning the horizon, their bodies tense. Something about their posture was wrong, too alert, too cautious. They were on edge. As he approached slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile calm, he could see that the ostrich's gaze was fixed on something in the distance, something he couldn't yet see. Their feathers bristled with unease, their powerful legs shifting slightly beneath them. Then, without warning, the ground trembled, faint but perceptible. It was a vibration that crawled up through the earth, spreading into the air. The ostrich's heads snapped up in unison, their bodies tensing further. Their sharp eyes narrowed and they began to move, not toward the safety of the trees, but toward the source of the disturbance. The researcher's heart quickened as he realized that something was very wrong. He followed them, maintaining a safe distance, his feet barely making a sound on the dry earth. The trembling increased, reverberating through the ground with a growing intensity. It was not an earthquake, but something far more specific. The first movement appeared through the trees. At first it was a blur, a dark shape moving through the undergrowth. As it came closer, the researcher's breath caught in his throat. It was another ostrich, larger than the ones he had seen before, its feathers matted with dust and blood. It moved awkwardly, but with a determined force, its eyes locked on the 3 ostriches that had been leading him. The tension in the air became almost unbearable. The researcher knew then that he was witnessing something that had been building for a long time, a territorial war, one that had been simmering beneath the surface of the sanctuary's serene exterior. He had heard rumors of clashes between rival ostrich groups before, but never had he thought he would witness one in such a raw and brutal form. The group of ostriches he had been following slowed their pace as the newcomer approached. The 2 groups stood facing each other in the open clearing, their heads raised high, their sharp beaks glistening in the fading light. The larger ostrich let out a low, menacing call, a sound that reverberated through the air. The smaller group responded in kind, their feathers flaring up in a display of aggression. The red light drew back to rest. Then, without warning, it happened. The larger ostrich lunged forward, its legs powerful and swift. The fight that followed was brutal. 2 massive birds colliding with such force that the ground shook beneath them, The sound of their heavy bodies crashing together was deafening, a thunderous, bone-shaking thud that echoed through the forest. The researcher was paralyzed. He had never seen such raw violence from creatures that had always seemed so majestic and serene. The two ostriches locked beaks, their powerful legs kicking and slashing at each other. The air was thick with dust, and the rustling of leaves in the chaos only added to the sense of escalating danger. The fight escalated as the other two ostriches from the smaller group joined in, and the researcher could see the fierce determination in their eyes. This was a battle for dominance, a fight for territory and survival, but it was also a desperate fight for the future of their species. Amidst the battle, there was a moment when everything seemed to freeze. The researcher's gaze fell on the larger ostrich, and for a split second their eyes locked. There was a strange intelligence in that gaze, something unsettling in the way the bird seemed to acknowledge his presence. The researcher felt a chill run down his spine. It was as if the bird was aware of him, as if it knew he was not just a mere observer, but an intruder in a world that had its own laws, its own rhythm. Then, as quickly as it had started, the battle came to an abrupt halt. The larger ostrich, its feathers matted and bloodied, slowly backed away, its eyes never leaving the smaller group. The remaining ostriches, equally exhausted and wounded, stood motionless for a long moment, their heavy breathing the only sound breaking the silence. It was over. The larger ostrich had won. The researcher slowly exhaled, his heart still racing. He had witnessed something extraordinary but also deeply unsettling. The serenity of the sanctuary had been shattered. The tension in the air had not yet dissipated, and he knew that the battle for dominance would not end here. It was only a matter of time before it would happen again. As the larger ostrich turned and walked away, the researcher could feel the weight of the encounter settle on him. The sanctuary was not the peaceful haven he had once thought. It was a world where survival was not guaranteed, where every creature, no matter how majestic, fought relentlessly for its place in the hierarchy. And as the last traces of sunlight disappeared, the forest seemed to hold its breath once more, waiting for what would come next. The sounds of the battle still lingered in the air, a reminder that in this world, nothing was ever truly peaceful. The researcher remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the retreating figure of the victorious ostrich, a sense of awe and unease settling in his chest. In this wild, untamed place, even the largest and most powerful creatures were not safe from the constant struggle for survival, and the war, though won for now, was far from over. The air was thick with the scent of dust and sweat, and the sun had now fully dipped beneath the horizon, leaving only the faintest trace of light above the trees. The researcher stood rooted to the spot, still absorbing the chaos he had witnessed. His heart pounded with the adrenaline of the moment, but beneath that rush was something deeper, a quiet realization that he had stumbled upon a much larger story than he had ever anticipated. This was not just a conflict between a few rival birds. It was the untold drama of survival, of instincts that shaped the very fabric of this place. For a long time, he didn't move. He knew he should retreat to his camp before night fully set in, but something kept him there, watching the clearing where the battle had taken place. The group of ostriches, now scattered and silent, seemed to have retreated to the edge of the forest. The larger bird, victorious but weary, stood still for a moment. Its head swiveled, scanning the surroundings, as though it was aware of something else lurking in the shadows. Then it happened, something the researcher had not expected. From the other side of the clearing, out of the thick underbrush, another silhouette emerged. It was a figure that hadn't been there before. Another ostrich, larger than the others, its legs strong and purposeful as it moved into the light. The newcomer was unlike any ostrich the researcher had seen. Its body was heavily scarred, as if it had endured countless battles. It moved slowly, deliberately, its gaze fixed on the victorious bird in the clearing. The tension was immediate. The researcher felt a creeping dread in the pit of his stomach. This was not just a territorial dispute anymore. It was something much deeper. The new ostrich moved into the space between the rival birds, locking eyes with the victor, its posture unwavering. The other ostriches in the clearing backed away, but the newly arrived bird didn't move. For a long while, the two birds stood motionless, facing each other across the clearing. The air was so still it felt suffocating. The tension was almost unbearable. The researcher took a careful step back, his every sense on edge. He knew this wasn't just a fight for territory anymore. This was a war. Suddenly, without warning, the larger ostrich in the clearing let out a deep, resonant call, loud enough to shake the trees. It was a sound of defiance, a call to battle. The newcomer responded, not with sound, but with movement. The two birds surged toward each other faster than the researcher could have imagined, and within seconds they collided once more, their bodies crashing into one another with bone-jarring force. The intensity of the fight surpassed everything the researcher had witnessed before. This was no longer just a physical clash, it was a war of wills, a battle for supremacy that would define the future of the sanctuary. The ground shook as their powerful legs stomped and kicked, their sharp beaks snapping, their bodies moving with a brutal precision. The other ostriches stayed back, watching with a kind of eerie stillness, as though they knew this battle was not theirs to fight. The researcher's heart raced as he moved further back into the shadows of the trees. The moonlight filtered through the canopy above, casting long, jagged shadows across the clearing. But even as the light touched the scene, it only seemed to deepen the sense of something ancient and primordial unfolding before him. This was nature at its most raw, a fight for survival, for dominance, for legacy. The battle between the two larger birds grew fiercer with every passing second. The dust rose in thick clouds, obscuring their movements, but the sound of their violent clashes rang clear. Every strike, every desperate lunge seemed to echo in the researcher's chest. He felt as though he were a part of it, caught in the ebb and flow of power and instinct that had existed long before humans had ever set foot in this place. Then, suddenly, a deafening silence fell over the clearing. The birds stood still, panting, their feathers ruffled and coated with dust. The newcomer, bloodied but still standing, took a slow step back, its eyes locked on the victor. The larger ostrich, breathing heavily, seemed to consider the situation for a long moment, its powerful chest rising and falling. And then, without warning, it turned and began to walk away, its body still trembling from the brutal encounter. The newcomer didn't follow. The researcher watched, his breath caught in his throat, as the victorious bird retreated into the shadows of the forest. The remaining ostriches stayed where they were, as though frozen in place by the weight of what had just transpired. The silence that followed was complete, utterly still. Then the newcomer began to move, not quickly, but with purpose. It didn't approach the defeated ostriches, but instead began walking toward the opposite end of the clearing. The researcher instinctively followed, moving quietly through the underbrush to maintain his distance. The newcomer moved into a small, hidden hollow in the forest, a place the researcher hadn't noticed before. There, in the moonlight, the ostrich lowered its head and began to search the ground. The researcher watched as the bird moved deliberately, its eyes scanning the earth in a way that suggested it was looking for something specific. And then, with a sudden lurch of the heart, the researcher realized what the bird was searching for. It was the remains of another ostrich, one that had been defeated in a past battle, long since fallen, its bones scattered across the ground. The newcomer lowered its head, and with a powerful strike of its beak it picked up a bone and turned away. It was then that the researcher understood. The sanctuary was not just a place of life. It was a battleground, a place where only the strongest would survive. These creatures, once thought to be peaceful giants, were engaged in a war of attrition, a silent and ongoing struggle for dominance that would continue long after the researcher left. And with that understanding, a cold realization settled in his chest. The fight wasn't over. Not for the birds and not for him, because in the shadow of this war, there were other forces at work. Forces that even the researcher didn't fully understand. As the newcomer disappeared into the forest carrying the bone of its fallen kin, the researcher realized that he had been swept into something much larger than he could have imagined. The war was not just about territory. It was about the future of the sanctuary itself. The forest, it seemed, was always waiting for the next battle. And the next one was coming soon. The researcher stood motionless in the shadows, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. The clearing was still. The distant sound of cicadas filled the air once more, but there was something hauntingly different about the atmosphere now, an unsettling quiet, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. He could feel the tremor in the ground beneath him, not from the fighting birds, but from something more primal, something deeper. He hadn't been prepared for this. No one had told him that the sanctuary was home to such violent rivalries. It was meant to be a place of protection, of research, of understanding. But what he had witnessed was far from the peaceful coexistence he had hoped for. It was a brutal world where only the strongest endured, a place where survival was a constant, unspoken struggle. As the newcomer disappeared into the trees, the researcher felt an odd pull to follow. But he hesitated. Something told him to leave, to turn back to camp, to retreat before he became too entangled in a world that had its own rules, its own order. But the forest seemed to whisper to him, urging him to continue, to observe, to understand. The quiet urgency in the air made him feel like an intruder, yet at the same time like a participant in a story much larger than he was. Reluctantly, he took a few cautious steps toward the clearing's edge, keeping his eyes fixed on the space where the birds had fought. The dust had begun to settle, and the faint smell of blood lingered in the air, heavy and thick. The remaining ostriches, now fully subdued by the events, still stood near the trees, their heads low, their bodies hunched, as though awaiting the end of a storm. But there was one thing that still settled him, one question that gnawed at his mind. What was the role of the defeated birds in all of this? They hadn't been killed. They hadn't been consumed. They had merely retreated, wounded but alive. What kind of balance was this? How many battles had they fought? And what was this strange hierarchy in which each bird seemed to hold not just its place, but its history, its legacy, tied to the very bones of its ancestors? A sudden noise snapped him out of his thoughts. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rustling of the trees, then louder. The sound of hooves. The researcher's heart skipped. His mind raced as he dropped to his knees, trying to blend into the shadows. It was too late to retreat. The animals had already sensed him. He could hear them moving in the distance, coming closer, their rhythmic pounding getting louder. He peered through the undergrowth, eyes straining to make out the figures emerging from the tree line. His breath caught when he saw the shapes, a group of large, powerful animals, hyenas, several of them moving in a loose formation, their bodies low and their eyes glinting with the predatory intelligence that made them such feared hunters. They were heading straight for the clearing where the ostriches had fought. The researcher's pulse quickened. He could already hear the low growls and clicks of the hyena's jaws, and the sense of unease began to rise in his chest again. It wasn't just the fight between the ostriches that concerned him now. The hyenas would pick up the scent of the battle. They would scavenge, and no one, not the ostriches, not him, would be safe if the scavengers took an interest. Instead, the hyenas approached slowly, their movements deliberate. They moved in and out of the trees, their eyes scanning the ground, their ears twitching with every sound. The researcher held his breath, pressing his back against the rough bark of the tree behind him, his entire body stiff with fear. If the hyenas saw him now, he would be no better than the defeated birds, caught in the middle of a fight he had no part in. The lead hyena paused, its nose twitching in the air. For a long moment, it stood perfectly still, as if sensing the presence of something hidden in the shadows. The researcher's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. He knew that if it moved any closer, it would spot him. He had no weapon, no way to defend himself. Just the dense foliage and the silence he prayed would keep him safe. Then, as though guided by some unseen force, the hyena turned its head toward the clearing. Its eyes locked onto the injured ostriches standing motionless by the tree line. A low snarl rippled through its throat, and in an instant the hyena surged forward, their movements becoming fluid, instinctive. The researcher watched in horror as the hyenas surrounded the ostriches. The injured birds, weak and dazed, were caught in a deadly trap. The hyenas moved swiftly, their powerful jaws snapping with terrifying precision. The ostriches, despite their size and strength, were no match for the pack's ruthless coordination.